Okay, this is your quick introduction video to our next section in the course, Sandra Cisneros, Woman Hollering Creek and Other Stories. We'll be talking about Latinos in America, sometimes referred to as Hispanics or Chicanos, Mexican Americans. All of these terms are kind of used blanketedly to mean sometimes the same thing, sometimes mean a little different things. Each of them have their own sort of distinct usage. Another example of showing you that culture is heterogeneous. There are a lot of differences among the culture itself, within the culture. I'll give you a quick warning. My kids are moving up and down the stairs, dogs moving up and down the stairs, so we may get a little co-star here now and again. This video will hopefully be only 10-15 minutes. So Latinos are Americans, so that's important to know. When we talk about Latinos, we're talking about people in the United States of Latin American ancestry who have either immigrated here, have been born of parents who immigrated here, or other generations, and who self-identify as Latino. And there are a lot of cultural markers that tie them together. The largest population of Latinos in the United States has ancestry and immigration patterns from Mexico, and many of the other parts of Central America and South America have branches here in the United States as well, and Spanish is spoken amongst all Latinos in a variety of different ways, but the Spanish is sometimes a little bit different here and there. Dialects might be a little bit different, and as well as some of the indigenous languages from all of these regions sort of putting themselves on the Spanish language as well to kind of color them up a little bit. So to say that all Latinos speak Spanish is only true to an extent, and then it's not even true of some Latinos who grow up never having learned Spanish. So you run into all kinds of problems when we start to make those homogeneous sort of broad stroke brushes of painting culture as one thing or another. So we're going to be talking about Cisneros, Sandra Cisneros, who is Chicana, she's Latina, Mexican American, all of those things, okay? There's an important point to remind us again where the text that we're looking at in terms of our unit by unit basis is only one single text attempting to show us a little bit about that culture, okay? It's not going to give us everything and provide us with all we need to know about a particular culture. This is just one more good moment to remind you of that. But anyhow, Sandra Cisneros is a current writer, very current, very well known, in a lot of extremes, really even sort of mainstream popular. People may know her beyond academia and artistic circles, etc., into more of a I don't know if you want to call it a best-selling market even. She's a well-known author and writer, and she's been writing for quite some time, since the early 80s, and currently writing up until this day. She was born, as I said, in the U.S. She was born in Chicago, actually, in 1954, and her parents were born in Mexico. So her experiences, particularly those experiences of writing early, largely had to do with this sort of framework, okay? Chicana or Chicano, the male or female version, is sort of shorthand for Mexican American or American born of Mexican descent or some sort of derivation of that. So her identity coming up in the Chicano era of what is kind of usually referred to as the 1960s, 70s, has to do with that idea of being of Latino heritage, but born in the United States. And with this is a huge area of studies in this particular field, this sort of mixture or in-betweenness of American or Latin American. Where do they identify? And what we learn ultimately, and I'll get into this more when we look at her particular stories, ultimately is that something new is generated out of this, rather than an ultimatum, a one or the other, or a this one supersedes that one. There's a combination that becomes very, very powerful and very much a benefit. And that Chicana or Chicano identity is built around that sort of conceptual philosophy. So anyhow, she's part of that generation. And her parents were from Mexico. So much of her youth she spent traveling between Chicago and central Mexico, especially during the summers. She would take long trips down there and spend time with grandparents and sort of live, I guess we would call it binationally, summers in Mexico and the rest of the year back in the United States. And this was very much a sort of analogy for the way that her identity was being formed. And she would later write about this in a fictional sort of capacity in her first novel called Caramelo, where she sort of puts her own life into a fictional version and chronicles what it's like to live that kind of life going back and forth. She was the only girl among her parents' children. She had 6 brothers, and this was also a very impressionistic fact of her life. She would oftentimes, and in fact she's written an essay on this, referring to herself as only daughter. She's the only daughter that her father and mother have, but yet there's also the sort of double entendre of that she's only a daughter, because this is the sort of implication that she's not a male. And with that, we sort of open into some of the cultural variations of gender identity and gender politics, gender sort of preference. Latinos, generally speaking, are often driven by a sort of patriarchal sense of order, right? And we're being very general when we say this, but we're sort of just opening up the discussion with this. And I'm sure most of you have heard of the term macho or machismo, which we could identify. We could sort of hack out a definition for ourselves. But this comes, some of us may know, some of us may not have known, this is a Spanish word. And it refers to the very brave, strong physically and emotionally, and dominant and powerful, and always in control, and superior masculine traits, right? We could describe something, free of culture by saying that's a very macho way to behave, right? And this is something that Latino cultures in general sort of presuppose is part of the cultural makeup. And so if you have that sort of framework going into the male makeup, oftentimes what is the coefficient is something that's oftentimes referred to as Marianismo or Marianismo, which is sort of the component that feeds the macho, the attitude, the idea of the suffering woman, the saintly, puritanical, supportive, and feminine, pure woman's role as a component of womanhood. Okay? And so these two terms, machismo and Marianismo, sort of work in context to create a cultural, and again we're being general because we could tear this open even more, but a cultural sort of map of the way that genders work within Latino cultures. And then you get into that, especially writers in the 80s and beyond begin to tear that open even more, and writers like Gloria Anzaldúa, who's also very famous, starts to write about queer identity and lesbian feminism and third sex and all of these other things that begin to tear any sort of binary, meaning two extremes, tears that apart a little bit. But for our purposes, we'll kind of just keep it with that simpler map of male and female, almost stereotypes is what we'll call them. Okay? And so Cisneros, really sees this as a potential area that she can write into. And she's a poet. She's been a poet, primarily started out as a poet and then wrote some short stories and a novella that's kind of made up of short stories and children's books, and her novel that I mentioned that she published after a long time of work from a MacArthur Fellowship, Guggenheim Fellowship. Published it in the early part of the 21st century. Also very comprised of the short story sort of element within this larger novel. And all of her work sort of has a poetic quality to it. So it's fair to see that she's got a poetic sense to all of her writing. I don't know, if she would agree or not, but in my take of it, her work is very beautiful in a sense that really, really reveals a deep love of poetry. The book that we're going to be looking at was published in 1991. It's called Woman Hollering Creek and Other Stories. And some of the stories were published before. Some of them were written strictly for this collection. But she put them all here together and decided to publish them while her and her publisher got together and did all, how book publishing works. And she decided to publish them under this title with this idea that this would be the concept as well as one of the titles of the stories as well. And the last thing I'm going to tell you about for your intro has to do with a little bit of idea of this title, Woman Hollering Creek. And in your next video, I'm going to tell you more about these cultural figures in Latina's life, okay? But right now, I'll give you information on one in particular that will help you. But along with this sort of machismo-marianismo dichotomy that really presents male and female identity roles, Latinas have long, and academics in the field have studied and researched this, Cisneros being one of them, have said that there have been over time cultural sort of correctives that drive the female identity into certain forms, right? And Gloria Ansaldúa, in her book Borderlands, which I'll make a reference to on your Blackboard page, she breaks it down really distinctly by looking at three female figures that influence Latina supposed preferential identity. And she mentions these, and we're not going to go into these now. I'll go into these on the next video. She talks about La Virgen de Guadalupe, the Virgin of Guadalupe. She talks about La Malinche. If you've never heard of La Malinche, we'll hear about it on the next video. And then the last one she mentions is a figure by the name of La Llorona, who is loosely translated into English, the Weeping Woman. And the story of the Weeping Woman I'll save for the next video as well, but essentially what we have is a woman who is being scorned by a lover and seeks out revenge on him, and is ultimately, because her revenge fails and she feels as if she's destroyed her own life, she's reduced to her most basic emotion, which is sort of what the story reinforces, is that women are solely emotional creatures and they have they're slaves to emotion over logic. And she's just left in this wailing, sort of weeping, haunting mess. And the figure of La Llorona is meant to be a haunting ghost story told to young women and young children in a way that sort of, in its most innocent of ways, it kind of prevents them from wandering out after dark. But it also sort of has undertones of anti-feminist identities as well. Do not be too much of a strong woman, or you'll simply bow down to your emotional misgivings. And so the weeping woman, the figure of this scorned, depraved, destroyed woman haunting dreams of people down by a creek, because I'll give you a little bit of a spoiler alert of the story. In the story, one version of it, she drowns her children down at a creek and is immediately sorry for doing this. And so she begins wailing and crying and continuously haunts the creeks looking for her children. And this is a figure of feminine identity that Latinos have ingested in different versions over the years and years and years. And it sort of reinforces that weakened, Marianismo-driven, oh, woe is me sort of womanhood. Well, what the title of this book and what the spirit of these stories and the spirit of Latinas who write in the mid-'80s and earlier, but mid-'80s is really a huge explosion for this. They write to sort of turn that line of thinking and really punch holes in it. And one very blatant, obvious way that she does this is in this creative sort of juxtaposition of a weeping, crying, moaning woman with a hollering woman, a woman who doesn't weep by the creek, but a woman hollering creek. Okay, and hollering sounds much more aggressive and combative and almost active in terms of its sort of existence in the world, rather than just, oh, I'm so forlorn, etc. And she takes that sort of spirit of turning that emotive quality of women into something else, kind of like an overturning of the Uncle Tom character. I wouldn't necessarily make the one-to-one comparison there, but kind of that click where it says, let's turn this around. And she uses it to sort of look at progressive change for Latinas that's coming. And so this book, Woman Hollering Creek, carries that title as its sort of mantra. The women here are going to grow in terms of their relationship. And just to sort of set up the collection, you'll notice that the stories we read at the beginning are of younger girls. And as they go a little bit further, we get some adolescence, and on into the later ones, we get some full-on women who experience much different things than the characters at the beginning of the book did. And that's kind of one of the easier threads to follow, but you're going to see some others as well, where there's some thematic connections between the stories, maybe even some of the characters that you might say, this one is that, etc. But we're not reading all the stories. The stories we're reading are listed there on your schedule, so make sure you're paying attention. We will discuss them in the next video, but as for now, good luck with your reading.